There's nothing like your favorite linen shirt, and I have a new favorite today, New Look 6197, in the cutest tropical parrot print linen from Threadymade. I knew I wanted a slightly cropped and boxy fit, so I have sewn View A, the men's shirt, cropping it by about 4 inches at the hem and also shortening the sleeves by 3.5 inches. I've left in the top button loop, which is my favorite part of this shirt. The casual style and color palette of the shirt worked out as a perfect complement to my new designer bag from Teddy Blake. I received this bag just in time for my birthday, and what a gift it is. Premium Italian leather dyed and treated to withstand the test of time. These bags are made in Italy, come in an extensive and always growing range of styles and colors, all at a fair price lower than other high-end designer handbags. This is the 13-inch Gigi Stampado in brown. I love the large size and the color that goes with so many outfits. I'll leave the link in the description. Now let's start making a beautiful classic button front shirt. For the pocket, we're going to fold the upper edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. Once that top edge is pressed in place, turn it to the right side. Fold the upper edge once again so the materials are right sides together, folding it by 1 inch. Now that we have those top folds in place, we're going to sew this flap down on each outer edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to trim those top corners turn the top of the pocket right side out. Give the top of the pocket a good press, also pressing the sides and bottom edges of the pocket to the wrong side by 5/8 inch. For that bottom folded edge of the top flap, I'm going to sew from one side to the other, edge stitching close to the bottom of the flap. Now I'll place the wrong side of my pocket on the right side of my left front bodice piece. Place the top corners of the pocket at the large dots transferred from the pattern piece. Then I can pin in place along the side and bottom edges. Then I'm going to edge stitch along the sides and bottom of the pocket, back stitching at both top edges to secure. Along the top edge of the back bodice piece, we have pleat lines indicating where we're going to be folding the fabric. I'm going to do that on the fabric, folding from the fold line to the pleated line so that the lines are on top of each other, and pin that fold in place. I'll do the same on the other side. Now I've formed a pleat in the fabric, and I'm going to baste along the top edge. Now we're going to attach the yoke to the back piece, placing the yoke and the back piece right sides together along that top edge and pinning in place. Sew that yoke seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the edges together, and press the seam up toward the yoke. Now we'll take our front bodice pieces and place them right sides together with the back yoke, aligning the shoulder seams and pinning in place. Then we're going to sew the shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together once again, and then press the seams back toward the yoke. And here's what that back bodice should look like so far, with all of our seams pressed toward the yoke. Here is the little loop piece, and we're going to fold it in half so that the long edges meet, right sides together. And I'll go ahead and pin the long edges. Then we can sew this loop piece with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then turn it right side out. To turn the little loop right side out, you could tie a thread to one end and then place that hand needle through the center and then pull it right side out. Then we can give our loop a good press. Here is the very top center edge of my left front bodice piece, and this is where we're going to be attaching the loop. Folding that loop piece in half, and I'm going to place it about 7/8 inch away from the top edge, aligning the raw edges of the loop with the raw edge of the center front and pinning in place. Then I'll baste the loop in place. I've applied interfacing to both of my front-facing pieces. I'm going to take both of these pieces to my serger and finish the shoulder edges, as well as the inner curved edges. Now I'll place each of those facings right sides together with their corresponding center front bodice edges and pin together along the center fronts. Then we'll sew both of those straight seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to understitch the facing. I'm going to turn the facing over its seam allowance and then sew the facing to its seam allowance about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. And we'll do this for both facing pieces. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of one of my collar pieces. Now we're going to stitch through this one collar piece from one side to the other along the notched edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that we have that stitching in place, find the dots transferred from your pattern piece. Clip through the seam allowance at both of those dots, careful not to clip through the stitching line. Then we can trim that center clipped section to 1/4 of an inch. And press it to the wrong side along the stitching line. Now we can place our collar pieces right sides together and pin along the sides and the bottom. Now I have the collar pieces pinned together along the sides and the longer bottom edge, and we're going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, leaving this entire notched section open. I'm going to trim those seam allowances that we just sewed, also trimming those corners. Then we can turn the collar right side out and give it a good press. Now we can place that edge of the collar that has not been clipped into right sides together with the neckline edge. We're going to match up those collar notches with the back bodice piece and pin in place. And then continue pinning the collar on both sides around the neck edge to get to the front bodice, aligning the side edge of the collar with the dot transferred from the pattern piece. This large dot toward the center front. And we're pinning the collar through both of its layers where we can. So now I have the collar pinned in place. Now we'll take our facings and fold them toward the bodice so that the bodice and the facings are right sides together with the collar sandwiched in between. And we'll pin this unfinished neckline edge right on top of the collar section that we've already pinned in place, so that the finished top edge of the facing lines up with our earlier clipping point. Do the same on both sides. Now we'll sew from one side straight across to the other with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, stitching through all layers, but careful not to catch this folded edge at the center interface portion of the collar. Now I'm going to trim this seam allowance straight across, also trimming those top corners. Now I'm going to turn the facings right side out and poke out the corners. Now at both of the dots that we clipped into earlier for the interfaced collar piece, we're going to clip into the seam allowance of the main collar seam at the same points, once again careful not to clip through the stitching. This will allow us to fully press this collar seam up toward the collar. Now that that collar seam is pressed, I'll place the folded edge of the collar right on top of the seam line to cover the stitches. and pin in place along the open section. Now that I have that center section pinned in place, I'm going to stitch in the ditch from the front of the garment, from the start to the end of my pinning, backstitching at both points to secure, sealing that open section of the collar. Now I'm going to use a needle and thread to sew my facing to each of those shoulder seam allowances on both sides. Now I'm going to place my front and back pieces right sides together, aligning the side seams. I'll pin both of the side seams, and then I'll sew both of them with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and press them toward the back of the garment. To prepare for the sleeve to be inserted into the armhole, we're going to sew basting stitches from notch to notch along the top of the sleeve, leaving thread tails on both ends so that you have threads to pull for easing. Then I'm going to press memory creases along the bottom of the sleeve. First, pressing the entire bottom edge to the wrong side by 1 1/4 inches, and then opening that out and pressing the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. Now we'll open out those memory creases for now and place the short edges right sides together and pin. Sew this underarm seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then I'm going to finish the raw edges together and press the seam back toward the back sleeve. Then I'm going to fold up the hem at the bottom of the sleeve to the wrong side along the pre-press creases, and then edge stitch close to that inner folded edge all the way around the bottom of the sleeve. Now, starting at the underarm seam, I'm going to place the raw edges of the sleeve right sides together with its corresponding armhole and pin in place. I'll also pin from the underarm seam to both of the notches on either side. And I'll pin at the dot at the top of the sleeve to the shoulder seam. Pull the basting stitches so that the sleeve fits the front of the garment. Once it fits, pin in place. And repeat to ease and pin the back of the sleeve. Now I have the armhole pinned, and I'm going to sew carefully all the way around, making sure not to catch any puckers. Then I'll finish my raw edges together and press the seam allowance toward the sleeve. Here is one of the outer bottom edges of the garment. I'm going to turn the facing so that it's right sides together with the bodice right along its sewing line, and pin in place along the bottom edge. Doing this on both sides. Then I'll sew these facings to the bottom of the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from the outside edge to the finished edge of the facing. I'm going to trim that bottom corner on both sides and then turn the facing right side out. Now those sections for the center front are finished, and we're going to press the bottom hem to the wrong side 5/8 inch, then press the raw edge once more to meet that crease so that we can roll it on top of itself and create a narrow hem. Now that our narrow hem is created at the bottom of the garment, we're going to edge stitch from center front, edge stitching right along that upper fold, all the way across to the opposite center front. I'm going to mark my button placement on the left front bodice, and then sew each buttonhole in place. And I'll sew each of my buttons in place across from their buttonholes. And now the top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Please subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.